Hi, everyone. Because everyone's on mute, so this is going to be an interesting experience. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Okay, thank you. I just want to let everybody know that we will be recording this and sharing it over the internet in some way. So if you're uncomfortable with being recorded, feel free to drop out, and we will certainly be providing this information in a written form later today in the form of a press release. I think I mentioned before we started, but if everyone could sort of introduce themselves in the chat box, that way we can sort of know who's here on the call, and be able to share the information with you once we're finished. I'll go over the agenda for today. We'll do a little bit of an introduction about this research project and about why we're looking at this information. We'll have about 30 minutes of presentation, and then we're going to ask a couple of our three of our partners that we've worked with through the APA, CCC, and other community groups to talk about the focus neighborhoods that we're looking at in this report, and they can talk about the report, how they've been responding to the self-response rates in their communities. And then we'd want to have like a discussion period. We would love to have your feedback on what you found most helpful, and we are intending to make this a weekly report and hope to have feedback on the information is most helpful and what you would like to see in that weekly report. We have welcomed press to this event, and there will be time for press to ask questions. There will be a press release that is going out later today with sort of the highlights of the findings of our research. So in a way of introduction, I think most of you have heard and worked with us before, but for those of you who are new and are not familiar with the Asian American Federation, we are a leadership organization that works with 70 some odd groups that provide social services to the Asian community. We support them in a variety of ways, including leadership training, technical assistance, the research part, which I'm a part of. I'm sorry, I did not introduce myself. I'm Howard Shee, the Research and Policy Director at the Asian American Federation. So we rely a lot on the census data and the American Community Survey, which is also relies on the census data for the reporting that we do, the policy reports and the demographic reports on the Asian American community. And our partners and member agencies rely on those to do the advocacy work that they do on behalf of our communities. So that's why we've been active in the past 3 censuses, including this one, to ensure that Asian Americans respond to the census, because I mean, there are other venues where we've discussed this before. It's really important for funding, representation, and civic engagement to have people participate in the census. The focus here today is to look at the Census Bureau's real-time self-response rates for the 2020 census. They've been publishing this data all the way down to the tract level, I believe, since late March. And there have been different resources that have been publishing the data and providing some analyses. There's a CUNY hard to count map from the CUNY Grad Center for Urban Research that has both the 2020 self-response rates updated as soon as they're released, and comparing them with the 2010 census self-response rates. The self-response rates doesn't have any direct data on race and ethnicity, so we can only infer what's happening within race and ethnic communities by looking at census tracts that have a high concentration of our community members. And that way we can look at census tracts that have either a majority or a plurality of a specific Asian ethnic group, or for Asians in general, and compare it with the other tracts that are around them to see if there is a difference in response rates that can be sort of correlated with our community. Again, we have to be a little cautious about, correlation does not mean causation, but it's certainly, this is meant as a tool to help us identify communities and neighborhoods that we might be wanting to target more outreach resources to. There have been other analyses that sort of looked at hard to count factors, population distribution, and we can do that for a lot of different groups, and we have done, there are a lot of resources out there that show, for example, like where the Nepali community is living and what previous response rates were, and what the language needs are. So this is meant to supplement those types of analyses that have been done. We will be looking at the total Asian population across the New York City and in New Jersey, and we will be able to do this analysis for larger Asian ethnic groups. Because we're relying on census tracts that have a lot of Asian ethnic group community population for a specific community group, we're only really able to do this analysis for the larger Asian ethnic groups like Bangladeshi, Chinese, Filipino, Indian, Korean, and Pakistani. Because the cutoff that we used was 20%. If a census tract had 20% or more of a specific population, we included them in this analysis. Any lower than that, I think we would be have trouble justifying that that specific ethnic group had any major influence on the overall self-response rate. That's not to say that it isn't important to look at communities like Nepali or Tibetan or Vietnamese. It's just that this methodology is not conducive to looking at those specific groups. But we can look at overall Asian groups and look at those neighborhoods, and we will use some examples there to demonstrate what's going on in those communities. If we go to the next slide. So the major impetus for this report is that the CUNY Grad Center, through their hard to count maps, did an analysis across the nation of all of the different census tracts, and they broke them up by small, medium, large, and really large cities. And we noticed that for Asians, if you look at small and medium cities, their response rates, or the average response rates, were much higher than non-Hispanic whites, and the overall response rates in those cities. But if you look at large, and particularly really large cities with over 1 million people, the Asian self-response rates are now below that of non-Hispanic whites and below or close, really close to the overall numbers. So we are a little bit concerned about the, sort of the flipping of the community compared to, small and suburban and non-urban areas versus the really large urban areas. And we wanted to see what was going on. Next slide, please. So just to provide a little context, this is a map of all of the Asian majority tracts that are in the really deep blue color. And so we see that there are, Chinatown, Sunset Park, Bensonhurst, Elmhurst, Sunnyside, and Jackson Heights, Flushing, East Flushing, Murray Hill, Bayside, and Jamaica, as well as Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park. So we kind of know where the populations are. What we have to do is superimpose the information that's provided on the self-response rates to see what's going on in terms of the 2020 census. Next slide, please. So if we look, so this is, okay, hopefully people can read it. I'll sort of read off what's going on here. This graph compares the response rates for the different ethnic groups we were able to look at for this analysis throughout all of New York City. If you look at the top line, the top two lines actually, the blue and the red, they are the Korean and Pakistani, the census tracts with 20% or more Koreans and 20% or more Pakistanis. Those census tracts are outperforming the New York City average, which is that blue bold line. I mean, not blue, yellow bold line right there. and the gray 50% Asian line, which is sort of the proxy for how well the Asian community is doing overall. So you can see that the outreach in the Korean and Pakistani community has really had a good impact on their performance, at least relative to the New York City average. If we look at the Chinese population, we see that it's in the middle. It's between it's below the New York City average and above the Asian 50% average. And this is the census tracts with 20% or more Chinese. And we'll dive into what's going on there. You really have to break that apart and look at neighborhood by neighborhood to see where the urgent needs are in terms of reaching out to the Chinese community. And then below that are the three communities that we're really concerned about. There's the Filipino community. These are the 20% Filipino tracts and 20% Bangladeshi and 20% Indian tracts. We see that they are underperforming both the total Asian numbers and the NYC average. But you'll notice that there seems to be a divergence in the Filipino numbers from the other two groups. So if we look at the next slide, please, you'll see that if you look at it from a different perspective of how the self-response rates are changing from week to week, you see that the blue on the bottom is for April 14th to April 21st. Orange is from April 21st to April 28th, and then the gray is April 28th to May 5th. So you'll see that the NYC average rate of change over that period of time was 7.9%, about 8%. You see that Korean and Pakistanis, they not only do they have a higher rate, as we saw in the previous slide, of self-response, but we're seeing that they are increasing that self-response rate much faster than the city average. You see that the Chinese numbers are pretty much in line with the Asian numbers in terms of rate of growth. Filipinos, you'll notice, are really have really picked up their self-response rate, particularly in that orange time period where there was a significant boost in the number of people responding, or the percentage of people responding. And what we're really concerned about is that the Bangladeshi and Indian communities, they have low self-response, but they also are not really increasing their self-response rate at a fast enough clip to sort of catch up with the rest of the city. So that's where we're really concerned. We want to not only encourage the Korean and Pakistani community to continue to accelerate, with their self-response rates and make sure that they don't start losing pace, but we also want to make sure that we help the communities that are sort of falling behind and making sure that they get the resources they need to be able to do that outreach. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we will be looking at both several boroughs. I believe we're looking at Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx. And we'll also look at specific neighborhoods within those boroughs. I'm going to start off by looking at Queens, and then I'll hand off to Ahmed for my colleague Ahmed for the rest of the presentation. So if you look at the Queens response rates, they're kind of in line with the citywide numbers, except with the exception of the Chinese, which is in that second line, the orange line, where now you see within Queens, the Chinese community is actually outperforming the Queens borough average and the Asian average. Whereas before citywide, they were kind of in between the two. So you're seeing as we break down by geography, some areas with the Chinese community are doing better than others. And we'll see what's happening in the subsequent slides. And again, we see Filipino, Bangladeshi, and Indian are below the average, with a divergence in the Filipino community accelerating their rate of participation. And we see, the really good efforts that are happening in the Korean community that are outpacing the citywide average. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, I'm staring at the wrong one. Okay, so switching to the perspective of the rate of change, we again see similar trends from the citywide average, although the Chinese community seems to be picking up the pace in Queens. If you remember, it was around 9% citywide for the Chinese community, but in Queens, it's almost close to 10%. And then you see the high rate of change in the Filipino community, and then the worrisome lower numbers for the Bangladeshi Indian community. So I'm going to hand it over to Ahmed, if you want to take over. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Howard. Hi, everyone. My name is Ahmed Budd. I'm a census organizer with AAF. I'm going to take over for the duration of the presentation. The slide that we have up now is looking at the impact of Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park on the Queens response rates. So what we're doing now and what we're going to do for a few of the neighborhoods that we're looking at, we're going to see how looking at, in this case, the 20% Indian and Indo-Caribbean community in Queens, how census tracts with that benchmark for the population fare when we exclude particular neighborhoods. That way we can see or estimate in some way the impact that individual neighborhoods are having on response rates for census tracts with a plurality of specific communities. So in this case, we can see that the general trend line for Indian and Indo-Caribbean communities in Queens, we have something that is relatively low. The orange line that we have above is the Queens average. And when we exclude these two neighborhoods, Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park, from the Queens Queens average for the Indian and Indo-Caribbean communities, we can see that creates the blue trend line over here that actually just marginally surpasses the Queens average. This suggests to us that for outreach efforts focusing on the Indian and Indo-Caribbean communities, Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park should be neighborhoods of priority. So we're going to get started looking at some maps that focus on neighborhoods. We're going to look now at Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park. So we can see with this map where the neighborhoods are located geographically. The deeper blue areas have the larger populations of the Indian and Indo-Caribbean community. And just for clarity's sake, the Indo-Caribbean community will include Guyanese, Trinidadian, and other ethnic groups within it. So this way we can observe at the census tract level how the population percentages are broken down. This is a new map here. So this one is measuring the response rate change over a roughly 3-week period. It's 22 days to be exact. So the average response rate change in New York City is approximately 10%. Most of the tracts we're looking at here fall under that margin. Richmond Hill particularly does not have as much of a variation as we saw in some other neighborhoods as to this centralization of lower response rate change. To make this more clear how the colors are broken down, this deep red that we have here is 0 to 5% response rate change. This middle shade is 5 to 7.5%. Over here is 7.5 to 10%. And this shade where it's not really red anymore, more of like a sand color, that's 10% and up, meaning it's at or above the average change. So now what we're doing actually is combining those two maps. So for this map, we're only looking at the census tracts that fell under the 0 to 5% change, because those, you know, clearly they've had the least improvement in response rate change over the 3 weeks that we're looking at. It's overlaying the first map that we showed, which is a population percentage map for the Indian and Indo-Caribbean communities. So we're combining these two maps, and we have one hue of red, the 0 to 5% dark red hue that previously shown, overlaid on top of the blue map. And what that does is it creates a purple gradation that now, based on the deepness of the shade of purple, we can see all the tracks that have a purple shade, or even a red shade, a pink red shade, as is in this case, in a track that has a 0 to 10% population for Indian and Indo-Caribbean communities. We can see there are a few different shades of purple that are created, such as over here, here. Then we have slightly darker shades of purple, and then we have the deepest shade over here, which we also have street labels for, just to make it a bit more clear for organizations working in these neighborhoods where these areas of concern are. So the deeper the gradation, the larger percentage of the community, ethnic community population lives in that census tract. But all the tracts that have a purple shade or a red shade fall into 0 to 5%, a response rate change category over the 3 weeks that we're looking at. We're not going to look at South Ozone Park, and the analysis is the same over here as well. You can see that the population, the communities are a bit more centralized to specific geographies. And now, looking at the response rate change, you can see that there's also, in the case of South Ozone Park, a lot of areas that fall into the 0 to 5% benchmark. Some of the tracks that we observe here with the maps overlaid.
Hello.
Some of the tracks that we observe here, that we have the response rate change overlaid top of the population percentage, we can see that there are some areas of concern that are a deep purple shade, as well as some that have a mid or light purple shade. We've labeled these, for example, over here below Rockaway Boulevard and between 114th Street and 128th Street, there's a deep purple area. And further below it, still inside South Ozone Park, there's a mid-purple shade. So now we're going to shift our focus onto Flushing. This is now also going to look at the Chinese community. So this is a graph of tracts in Queens that have a 20% Chinese population, and we're overlaying that to the Queens average and looking at what happens when we exclude Flushing from the 20% Chinese census tracts that we look at in Queens. So we'd already previously seen when Howard had shown the response rate graph for Queens overall, that the Chinese community in Queens does actually respond at higher rates based on this 20% metric than the Queens average. When we exclude Flushing, that gets bumped up even a little bit higher. This suggests that when looking at communities in Queens that fit into this 20% or greater population percentage, putting effort into those census tracts that are located inside Flushing will have an impact, raising the overall response rate for census tracts that have a plurality of Chinese community members. Over here, we're looking at tracts that have a majority Chinese population. So now we see that the average for Queens for majority Chinese census tracts is actually below the borough average overall. but when we exclude Flushing, that average actually goes above the borough average. So what we're seeing here is that for the most dense Chinese communities in Queens, the tracts that have a majority population, there's a really, really significant impact that's had just from the tracts that are located in Flushing. I'm going to show you now just how Flushing, the population is broken down. So in Flushing, a lot of the tracts, I'd say most of the tracts, actually have a majority Chinese population. So for these census tracts that are majority Chinese in Queens, Flushing is an important place to focus. The response rates do vary rather significantly throughout Flushing. There is one area inside East Flushing as well that we're going to be looking at. So now we're looking only at the 5% and below response rate change census tracts, and we have that overlaid over still the Chinese population percentage. We can see the area surrounding Roosevelt Ave has a low response rate change and a very high population percentage. The same is true for this area below Franklin Ave and this area in East Flushing below 45th Ave. We're also going to take a quick look at Sunnyside Woodside. So we can see there is a plurality Asian population in these two neighborhoods, and there's a majority Asian population in Woodside here. Looking at the response rate change, these two neighborhoods are in a pretty good place. Most of them have an above average or at average response rate change. And there are only a few areas that are below average, and only even less that are below the 5% threshold. So when we superimpose that onto our population map, we see that there's one census tract in particular in Elmhurst, Maspeth, that stands out as an area of concern. So now we're going to jump to Manhattan. Those are all the Queens neighborhoods that we're looking at for this presentation. So we can take a quick look at this Manhattan response rate graph. So we'll see that for tracts that have a majority Chinese population, there's significantly reduced response rate compared to census tracts that just have a 20% plurality of Chinese population, and then that both are even less than the average for the borough. So for a neighborhood to look at specifically, we're going to take a look at Chinatown. So we can see that most of these census tracts, there's a couple, this one is technically labeled under Soho and this one in the Lower East Side, but these have a majority Chinese population, and there are a couple others that have a 40 to 50% population, and over here 30 to 40%. So now looking at the response rate change, we see there is a lot of variation here as well. There are some that fall in the 7.5 to 10% range. There's one right here that falls into the 5 to 7.5% range. These are in the 10% plus range, meaning they're at average or above average for the city. And this tract over here is in the 5% or below range. So when you take a closer look, superimposing the response rate change of 5% or below on top of the Chinese population map, we see that we can have a bit more clarity as to where these areas of concern are located. And we can see that there's a Rutgers House NYCHA building that falls under the census tract that is a really deep purple, 50% or up, a Chinese population, and 5% or below response rate change over the 3 weeks. Over here as well, this doesn't show up because it's in the 5 to 7.5% response rate change category, but we have the Smith houses located here, and it still has a 40 to 50% Chinese population. So we're going to look at Brooklyn now and a couple neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So we see that Brooklyn has a plurality for the census tracts, Pakistani community and Chinese community. Looking at the Pakistani community census tracts, so we see that they perform above average compared to the borough. And we saw previously also against the NYC average, they perform better. Looking at the 20% Chinese tracts, we see those are below average, and then the 50% Asian tracts are further below that. So you may have noticed that there is variation between the boroughs for the Chinese community. There are majority Chinese census tracts in Manhattan, Queens, and in Brooklyn. So when we compare them to the New York City average, we can see that the Queens and Manhattan majority census tracts are really neck and neck, just within less than 1 percentage point. But the majority Chinese census tracts in Brooklyn are much further below those of Manhattan and Queens. So now looking at the Sunset Park neighborhood and the Chinese community, we can see that, again, we're doing an exclusion map, or exclusion graph to show the impact that would be had when excluding Sunset Park from an analysis of the majority Chinese census tracts in Brooklyn. So over here at the very bottom, we have our response rate overall for majority Chinese census tracts in Brooklyn. Up here we have the Brooklyn average, and in the middle, that's the majority Chinese census tracts in Brooklyn when excluding Sunset Park. So from this, we can infer that there is some impact that could be had by focusing, if you're focusing on the Chinese community in Brooklyn, focusing specifically on Sunset Park will have a positive impact for the majority Chinese census tracts. So now we're going to take a look at map of Sunset Park. Sunset Park East is where a majority of the population is. We see that there's a lot of census tracts that fall into the 50% and up majority category. And there's a lot of variation in certain areas as well. As for response rate change, we see there are a couple census tracts that within Sunset Park that have a 5% or below response rate change. There are some others that fall in the 5 to 7.5% category. So these areas are important as well. They're still relatively below the city's average. And looking now at that 5% change superimposed on the population map, we see that between 7th Ave and 9th Ave, we have this census tract, as well as those other census tracts between 7th and 9th Ave that had between a 5 to 7.5% change. Now looking at Bensonhurst, we actually see an opposite effect. So the top is the Brooklyn average again. This time in the middle, we have the average for majority Chinese census tracts in Brooklyn. And then below that, this time we have the response rates for majority Chinese census tracts in Brooklyn when we exclude Bensonhurst. So the reason for this is that compared to the rest of Brooklyn, the majority Chinese census tracts that are located inside of Bensonhurst are actually having only a marginally better response rates compared to the other census tracts in Brooklyn that are also majority Chinese. This does not mean that you should only put your efforts in Sunset Park and not in Bensonhurst. The response rates are still far below the Brooklyn average, and we'd like to see those go up as well. So now looking at a map of Bensonhurst, you can see that the populations are distributed pretty widely. There are some areas that are very dense in the majority, 50% and up benchmark. There are some others surrounding that are in the 40 to 50% range, but there's also a lot that are that are below that range as well, spread out across Bensonhurst. Looking at the response rate change, we also see that the lowest response rates changes are localized. They're in very small blocks of census tracts. Much of the area is in the 10% plus range or in the 7.5%, 10% range. There are some census tracts, such as this one in the northwest of Bensonhurst East, that is in the 5 to 7.5% range. Now looking at the map superimposed, we see there was also a couple census tracts inside Dyker Heights, but there are some deep purple areas in Bensonhurst East and Bensonhurst West that show up that were below the 5% threshold. Now we're going to take a quick look at the Bronx. For the rest of the presentation, we're going to be looking exclusively at maps. I'll explain why in a second. But this is a population map for the Parkchester area in the Bronx. We can see here that there aren't any census tracts that are above the 40% range, but you can see, for example, in Pelham Parkway, there's a 30 to 40% block here, and in Southview Bruckner as well. And looking at the response rate change, there are a lot of surrounding areas that are in the 5% below range. Pelham Parkway, I believe almost the majority, except this block over here and in the west, east side of Pelham Parkway, there was a 40%, a 30 to 40% Asian population. We see this in the 10% plus range. Parkchester has some lower response rates in the 5 to 7.5% range. Now looking at those maps superimposed, you can see that there are a few areas that stand out that have relatively high Asian populations and are in the 5% or below response rate change. So we have this one over here under Allerton Pelham Gardens, block over here in Pelham Parkway, at Soundview Bruckner. There's a deep purple census tract over here. And when we're looking at the Bronx, we also see that for tracts that have a plurality of Asian community members, the response rates overall are very similar to the response rates that we see for the borough on average. So these last two that we're going to look at are counties in New Jersey. So this is Hudson County. We see there's Jersey City and Hoboken. Some of the areas are very densely Asian, such as Newport over here, just outside the Holland Tunnel. There's a 50% plus Asian majority, and in parts of Jersey City as well. Now looking at the response rate change, most of the areas that had a plurality Asian population don't fall under the 0 to 5% category, but there are some, such as Newport tracts here, that fall under the 5 to 7.5% change category. So I'm looking at the map superimposed. For these two New Jersey counties, we're measuring up to 7.5% to include those tracts that had high populations, pluralities of Asian community members. Newport is here, which falls under that category. There are those 2 census tracts here in Jersey City that had large Asian populations as well. And yeah, we can see in the surrounding areas, there are some changes to the shade as well, but not as densely populated by Asian community members. Lastly, we're going to look at Middlesex County. So some of you may be familiar with Edison. Edison is a very large block within Middlesex County. Metuchen is right at the heart of Edison Township. It extends up north here to the deepest blue section we have up, as well as to this census tract right over here in the south, and then slightly to the west and the east and the west as well. There are sections in Woodbridge, such as Island, that have majority Asian populations in certain census tracts, as well as in Plainsboro, we have very large Asian populations. Now looking at the response rate changes, we see much of Middlesex County is doing well in terms of response rate. There are some areas that that fall under the 0 to 5% category, but the areas we're looking at before in Plainsboro and Edison and Woodbridge, much of those census tracts within those cities and townships that have large Asian populations are in many of them are in the 7.5 and up categories. So with the map superimposed now, we're looking at up to 7.5%. We see that there are some areas, the dark blue over here, here, and here, that now fall into the area of concern category. And that's all for the presentation. I'm going to pass the mic back over to Howard so he can begin the discussion.
Hi, thank you, Ahmed. Excuse me. And we wanted to invite 3 of our partners that have been working on the ground doing census outreach to talk a little bit about their reaction to the findings of the report. I'll go alphabetically. We invited Chaya, Drum, and Mingquan. So if I'm not sure who from Chaya is here, if you want to start off.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Howard.
Hi, Farzana.
Hey. So my name is Farzana Linda. I'm the Advocacy and Organizing Manager at Chaya. So yeah, I mean, a lot of what you shared in today is not super surprising. I think it's really helpful to know the breakdown by street, as well as what the overall numbers are looking like for different parts of like the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean community. So some of the things that we have been doing since the pandemic has been, phone banking and text banking, the list that the city has provided. We've done about 60 to 80 hours per week in the last month and a half. We've attended like virtual events. We are in conversation with a couple of DJs to host a potential virtual Punga party. So we're trying to do a lot of our work virtually, but we knew even before the pandemic what a challenge it was going to be, particularly in South Queens, to reach a lot of the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean community, even among like the population for among Indians. We know that there's huge diversity there, right? There's the Punjabi community, there's the Gujarati community. There's like so many people that come under that. And so I think a challenge for us has been the fact that like our presence in South Queens has not been longstanding. Chaya has been located in Jackson Heights for a very long time, and a lot of our reach is there. One of the things that we have been doing though is, South Queens, particularly Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park, have historically been underserved. They haven't had, only recently a few organizations in the last 2 years have been engaging with the community there, like Chaya, like Drum, Sadma, and a few other groups. And one of the things that we're finding is that people are very much in crisis at this moment in time. And so the greatest success that we've seen is engaging people through COVID relief efforts. We found that, you know, when the conversation initially is about COVID and asking people like, you know, what is it that they need? And the first concern isn't about the census. People are a lot more responsive, but this does mean that it takes a lot more time to engage with folks, and it requires a lot of follow-up. So what we've been doing, like this past weekend, we collaborated with some of the partners in South Queens, which include Drum, Caribbean Equality Project, and a few other groups that are working in the area, to do a food pantry and a grocery delivery service. So we were able to provide grocery bags for over 300 families and deliver food to over 700 households. And every single bag had a census poster, which all of you can find on the APA Complete Count Committee website at apaccc.org. And, you know, prior to this, we're focusing a lot of our efforts virtually, but most of the people in this area are not accessible virtually. And so a week and a half ago, I had a meeting with a few of the groups in South Queens that work specifically with the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean community to strategize and troubleshoot like what the gaps are right now in our outreach. And one thing that we found was that a lot of our groups have a relationship and we're able to engage with the Hindu community, but not the Christian and Muslim, South Asian and Indo-Caribbean community. And that was super helpful to, you know, kind of help us help inform what our strategy is going to be going forward as well. Was there anything else, Howard, that you wanted me to talk about?
Sorry, I was muted. No, that was great. I think it's great to hear what's going on, and certainly the detailed information about which groups specifically within the Indo-Caribbean and the Indian diaspora that we really need to outreach out to. Is there somebody from Drum on the call? I'd love to hear your reactions to the data and what you've been doing to help raise response rates in our community.
Yes, Howard. This is Will from Drum. Hi,
Will.
So I co-organize South Queens, which includes Richmond Hill and South Ozone Park, for Drum. We've organized our base there for now about 3.5 years. Our base, as like the larger base, is working class, mostly undocumented, low-wage workers. A lot of our base in South Queens is mostly Punjabi, some Pakistani, some Bangladeshi, well, and specifically for these neighborhoods that we're speaking about, and Guyanese, Trinidadian, and Surinamese from the Indo-Caribbean communities. I do want to also uplift and recognize that, like, the data, I know it's very hard to track data for the Indo-Caribbean community because many times Indo-Caribbeans are listing themselves either as Asian, Indian, or other. So, but outreach and engagement looks very different. And I think Farzana kind of spoke to this within the communities. So engaging the Punjabi community is how you do that is very different from engaging a Guyanese or a Trinidadian person. So with that being said, our work right now, you know, our work was very much, you know, we have like hired quite a few of our members to be outreach workers in South Queens. We had focused our census work, especially to focus a lot on South Queens. And obviously that shifted due to the pandemic. You know, we were expecting to do, like, our work has already been much on the ground, outreaching to people on the street. That shifted to making, like, focusing on calls. So what we've, like, also, like, we've been getting a lot of calls about needs as well and support during this pandemic, like folks going hungry, also not paying rent. So we've also had to readjust how we do our work. So we created this new campaign called Building Power and Safety Through Solidarity, which is a phone-based campaign where we've had our members call folks in the community around how they're doing, like what are some needs, their support that they need with, how to agitate, but also how to take action. And one of the ways we say to take action is to fill out the census. And from these calls, it's been a mixed bag, like, because folks very much now really need support, and the folks that our members are calling are mostly undocumented folks who actually, many of them, because they're also newer immigrants, have not actually heard about the census. While members are educating them around the purpose and that their data is safe, their information is safe, they're actually very hesitant to still fill it out. So to us, it's like we're like the members are still having to do a lot of education around census on these phone calls as well. And we have been trying to work to get faith institutions more involved and engaged, like, because a lot of our folks, a lot of community members, especially those that we especially need to reach in South Queens, are very much connected to the different faith institutions, like the Mundirs, the temples, the different masjids and churches, and the Gurdwaras. So how do we actually leverage those relationships that some of the other community groups may have more than Drum to actually get call lists to call their devotees to engage around Drum? Because the reality is we're not going to be doing like outreach and engagement on the ground for the foreseeable future, or maybe during the duration of the census. So how do we actually envision where we're reaching those who are not going to come up on like the van list or the predictive dialers that it's given to us by NYC Census, right? Those are the folks, and like 2010 and beyond that, like South Queens has always been undercounted because it's an immigrant population with a large non-citizen population. And I think that's representative of the other communities that you guys have shared today. Like, how do we engage undocumented non-citizens and actually in a census? And I think we really have to figure out how do we actually leverage community institutions for that. And that's something that we're trying to do. And when Drum members specifically are making calls, they're getting through with folks to fill out the census, they're asking, can you actually call other people to do that as well? Or are you willing to give us that information? So as a way of like still doing that organizing and building power and making folks like, realize and feel like they're actually have a stake in this. So like for us, the calls have really been like, yes, like we're in tough times, but how do we support each other? Why is it important, especially now, to fill out the census?
Great, thank you, Will. I'm gonna invite Bing-Kwan. I think scrolling through, I think I saw Chuck.
Yes, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
So thanks so much, Asian American Federation, for hosting this. I found the additional information on the change in response rates to be particularly interesting because I haven't seen that delta before, kind of the rate of change overlaid with the response rate. So that is super useful. Up to now, we've just been using the absolute response rate to target census tracts, but to see those two data sets overlaid actually is super interesting and will inform our future targeting of tracts. But I want to step back for a second and just remind us where we are in terms of the timeline, especially given the extension. You guys can hear me, right? Okay, great. So this is now the 10th week since the self-response period started. With the extension of the operational timeline, we actually have 12 weeks left before NRFU, before the non-response follow-up starts from the Census Bureau. So we're at less than halftime, I guess, in terms of doing our outreach before Census Bureau sends their door knockers. So that's a reason for optimism. We have a good amount of time left. And looking even further to the end of the self-response period altogether at the end of October, that's 23 weeks from now. So we still have a lot of time to make a difference in these rates and to impact it. That's the good news. I think the bad news is a lot of the Census Bureau's outreach in terms of mailers is done, right? We saw the bumps in certain census tracts in April with the multiple rounds of mailings of the survey. And I think the last set of mailers went out in the first week of May based on the new timeline. So there's gonna be a long kind of communication gap between now and when the Census Bureau door knockers go out. And so one of the key strategies that Minkwon's looking at is to fill that gap with direct mail. So we've designed a postcard. It's pretty direct. If I can share my screen, I guess maybe I can't, but we designed a very simple postcard that incorporates some new messaging, just saying, not so optimistic and more geared toward loss aversion, saying, Queens is lagging. You may miss out on, healthcare or health resources or economic stimulus or relief. It's not too late, respond now. And so gearing that messaging a little differently to light a fire under people's butts to respond. It's obviously been translated into, we have now in Korean and Chinese simplified and Spanish. And I'd be happy to share this template of this postcard that we have so that other groups can use it, deploy it, mail it out. So that's one key thing we're looking to do very soon. Fill that mail gap. Just flood people's mailboxes, remind them again to respond. A second thing we did and will continue to do, which was a lot of fun for our team, but I think also reached a lot of people, was chalking. So there's a lot of talk about the digital divide. That's absolutely real, right? We're starting to tap out, I think, those call lists and those contact lists and those texting lists, right? We're all doing that. So we're going super analog, and we're just chalking sidewalks outside of grocery stores. We did it once in just north of Murray Hill area, east of Flushing, at the H Mart. We did, a big sidewalk mural. We did it in English and Korean, and we had a couple of Chinese words in there. And we had a lot of fun doing it. So it was a refreshing moment for our team just to be out, safely, socializing a little bit. But also there are tons of passersby, tons of cars driving by, a lot of people asking questions. So we were able to spread the word. And then obviously we amplified that on social media and other stuff. So we'll probably do that again, targeting some of the tracks you guys highlighted, namely maybe the area around the Bland houses and Skyview in that part of Flushing. So yeah, those are our two big plans, I think. Direct mail, filling that direct mail gap between now and NERFU in August, and then doing very limited outdoor kind of engagement, mostly chalking in high traffic areas. Yeah.
Just a quick question, Chuck. Where are you getting the mailing lists from? Where are you getting the addresses from? Is that just through the van, or?
That's a great question. So yes, we have an existing arrangement with the New York Civic Engagement Table, and the New York Civic Engagement Table procured USPS residential address data from, I think it's called the Melissa database. And so we can target certain census tracts. And if you need help getting a van account, getting access to mailing lists, then I may be able to assist you. I think there are other organizations. I know Chaya works with NICET as well to have these mailing lists or to have access to the van database. And it's this van database is a little different from the NYC one, I'll also note. So the addresses, I think, are more robust in the New York Civic Engagement Table van.
Sorry, the perils of working at home. Somebody needs a homework. Oh, here you go. Let's see. We noticed somebody. Okay, so thank you, Chaya, Drum, and Minkwan, Chuck, Will, and Farzana for talking about what you guys are doing on the ground and how hopefully this data is going to be helpful for you in targeting your outreach. I'm noticing that there's somebody, Iram, you have your hand raised. Did you have a question that you wanted to ask?
Hi, this is Aram Hani from Apna Community Center. I don't have a question. I just want to share some of the work which we are doing for the South Asian community, especially Pakistani community.
Right.
Apna is an organization serving the community in Brighton Beach, in other parts of Brooklyn as well. So as you have mentioned, it's very good that we are able to see all these numbers, how the communities are responding. And for the Pakistani community, for the outreach, what we have done is we have utilized our Urdu ethnic media. So we have utilized 3 Pakistani TV channels, having our commercials in Urdu, including one of our imams speaking about census and one of the commercials. Then we have used our Urdu print media as well for doing the outreach in the community. We have our census workers working, and we have through text messaging and phone banking, because the app which city has provided, Hustle, does not have ability to have the scripts in Urdu language. So we have used another platform to have the messaging in Urdu, because the audience, the target audience for our campaign are mostly seniors, those who cannot read or write or understand English, unfortunately. So their preferred language is Urdu. So that's why we are utilizing Urdu scripts. And the messaging which we are doing along with English, we also focus on using our ethnic language, which is Urdu, Punjabi, and Bengali language in some of the cases when we have to do outreach. So that is the reason that people are more responsive to census. Yes, obviously, it's a very unforeseen situation right now. Outreach is more challenging. Many of the things which we have planned initially, we are not able to execute in that way. But still, we are trying to mobilize the community in whatever way we can. And Apna is also a distribution site for grab-and-go meals. So from that, every 3 days in a week, we are also utilizing and sharing info material for census posters and flyers and some V-count books to the children. So these are a couple of things which we are using. And apart from that, we have also launched our virtual pop-up site, a center every Saturday, so that there's a hotline number people can call, and then we can assist them in completing the census form.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. No other hands are raised. I think I do want to ask a question of the audience before we open it up for further questions. One is you can either do it in the chat or email us later, or you can feel free to share here verbally. I'd like to know what you found to be most helpful in this in this report, because we intend to release weekly updates on this information. And so we'd love to be able to get some feedback on what you found helpful, what you found, what questions are being raised, and how, where would you like us to do further analysis or do a deeper dive. That would be very helpful. I think we're seeing in the chat already a lot of discussions about what other businesses or organizations or communities should be partnering with in these specific areas. Feel free to keep sharing over the chat, and how other, what others organizations can we should bring in to help support us to do this particular work. So I'm going to open it up now to just general questions. People can, I think it's most helpful if you use the raise hand function in the, is it in the chat, or is it where, I don't even know how to use this thing. So if people have questions, feel free to either raise your hand or just let us know. See any hand raises? Nope. No questions. Those that were members of the press, if you put your email in the chat, we will be sending out a press release with sort of the top level findings of this report later this afternoon. Oh, Liz, I saw. Okay, you want to go ahead, Liz?
Hi, Howard, and hi, everybody on this call. Can you hear me?
Liz, you're echoing a bit.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Still an echo. We can kind of understand you, but it's still echoing.
Okay. Can you oh, sorry, hold on one second. I don't know why there's the echo, but I'd like to know if people have had experience with elderly who are afraid to complete it because they think it's government related and not nonpartisan. And have you gotten through using any creative strategies? And secondly, as the presidential election comes closer and it becomes clearer who might be the president, how can we, before October 31st, leverage that to help the undocumented community feel comfortable in completing the census?
So I don't know if anybody has reactions. I mean, I personally am not, haven't thought about the impact of the presidential election other than worrying about disinformation from potential candidates. And then the first one is about seniors. I don't know if any groups are seeing that reaction. I mean, I kind of, yeah. I mean, I kind of feel that it's that the digital technology divide has been the thing that has been more worrisome on my mind. But I'd love to hear from groups that are working directly with seniors. Anybody want to jump in? If somebody's trying to jump in, make sure you're not muted.
Hey, this is Will from Drum. We've had quite a few of our members reaching out to folks who are elders, seniors, and a lot of our folks are that we're reaching out to again are also undocumented. So the way we've engaged them is like people in general have been hesitant, especially of their immigration status, and once they're comfortable, it's that tech barrier is still there. So we've tried to figure out ways to actually help them fill it out as a way to like support like making sure they're getting counted. I don't want to go into detail of like how we've done that, but we have figured out ways to support folks who may not be tech savvy.
Great, thanks. Anybody else want to weigh in on either the senior question or the presidential election question? Okay, I'm going to mute for a second. Somebody's doing yard work. Okay.
There is a question.
There is a question. I'm looking.
Hi, Howard.
Oh, hi. Hi, Robin.
Yeah, this is Robin. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I've listened through Ahmed's presentation, and I see that Brooklyn has been included, Queens has been included, Manhattan and Bronx, but Staten Island wasn't there. And even though from the first map, I saw there are light blue tracks on Staten Island. And when at the same time, I was looking at data.census.gov, and I see that Asian population percentage-wise, Staten Island is much higher than Bronx. It's over 10. Well, even from the ACS estimate, Staten Island has an over 10% of Asian population, when Bronx is slightly higher than 3%, I think. I have to recheck that on that. But I would like to see more, if you're doing reports, I would like to see more about Staten Island too. Just a little suggestion.
Sure. Yeah.
No,
I mean, yeah. And also we have a team that's working on Staten Island, and Ahmed is a member of that team. So I think we were just conscious of both time and in the audience. I don't know if there's anybody else that's from Staten Island that's on the call, but we are certainly looking at that information and tailoring the outreach that's being done based on that information as well. We'd happy to share that with people if they're interested.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to talk to Clara this afternoon, so I'll find that out. I'll talk to her individually, but I will also, because I really love the idea when you overlap the two. One is the percentage of population, the other would be the percentage of increase. And so from our trainings, we haven't been done things that are this much to the details when we overlap the two. I really like the idea. So I was looking forward to see the same map for Staten Island too, because we shared other boroughs of New York City and 2 counties in New Jersey, but it's just, I didn't see Staten Island.
Yeah, we'll do that. Okay.
Thank you, Howard.
Okay, thanks, Robin.
How do I lower my hand?
You already lowered.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. You did. Let's see if there are any questions in the chat that people are raising. I think that's just a discussion. Let's see. From Wang Che, people are still pretty sensitive about physically meeting each other. When do you think would be the most auspicious timeline? We'll be able to do community outreach again. Ooh, that's, I think, a question for almost everybody. I know Mita's out there. She may want to have some opinions on that. But I kind of feel that even when we open up, the ability to do community outreach is going to be still limited in some fashion.
Did you want me to respond, Howard?
If you want to, I'm not. I don't want I'm not going to throw you under the bus.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think the general view in the conversations I've been having is that it echoes something that Will from Drum, which is it's better to make the plan on the assumption that we are not going to be opening up in time to have significant outreach possibilities before August 11th and NERFU starts. And it's really best to optimize and do whatever we can and plan and do whatever the assumption that we won't have those opportunities. And I think what we have seen is about when people are willing, like Chuck said, to go outside with PPE on and have a conversation. We've seen examples of people using tablets and wiping them down in between with sanitizer, but I don't really see, any reversion to what we were all planning, as recently as February 28th as being in our future.
Yeah, that's probably it's a good idea. I mean, yeah, not really sure how much we're going to be able to do in person. Just looking at the chats, you mentioned any other questions? There's a question from Nicole Cruz. What are helpful tips for those who do not trust the government or issues with citizenship? I mean, I think that's kind of a question that's sort of been answered in a lot of different webinars. People can weigh in if they want to, but I'm also cognizant of the time and the fact that we were kind of focusing on just the data on today. Let me see if there are any other questions. Somebody asked, did I miss the discussion of Central Asian population of Central Queens? Are you talking about like the Uzbeks and Kazakhs, or this is, if you want to clarify what that question was about? Is this Shazak? Is that your name? He asked about Central Asian population of Central Queens. No. Say a hi, yes. Oh, oh yes, Shazak. I was just asking about the question that you had. You were asking about Central Asians of Central Queens. Can you be a little more specific as what you mean by Central Asian? Okay, if Shazak, if you can just type in what you mean by Central Asian. Oh, I see it. Bukhari population. Oh, sorry. Just reading the chats in out of order. In Kew Gardens, Forest Hills, Regal Park. So it's going to be tough. We can see if we can look at overall Asian response rates in that in those neighborhoods. If I'm not mistaken, looking at that, since they're probably not a high percentage of those populations and those areas are doing relatively well, I don't think this analysis is going to be helpful in trying to target you know, populations that are kind of spread out and dispersed throughout the city and aren't like a high proportion of each census tract. We're just going to have to rely on working with community groups and partnerships for those particular communities and just hope that we can reach them. I don't think this analysis is going to be helpful in sort of identifying what specific neighborhoods or geographic areas they are in or where we should be doing extra outreach, unfortunately. Yeah, so I hope that answered your question. I see Sneha has her hand raised. His or her hand raised. Feel free to answer.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, so I am with the Census Bureau. I was hired for Hindi Urdu outreach, and I just wanted to invite everyone, you know, not just South Asians, but everyone who is working in specifically with linguistically and culturally, you know, appropriate and competent materials to drop me a line because, you know, outside of my census job, I was a research scholar and I was studying Afro-Asian solidarity before I started this job. And I was specifically studying the media that were used for Afro-Asian solidarity. So I'd love to talk with you folks, you know, and you know, see what people think about some of those strategies from back in the day. Thank you. My email address is in the chat, but you know, it's just my first name, middle initial, and last name at 2020census.gov. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the offer to connect. Anybody else would like to comment or ask a question? Otherwise, think we're rolling up 2:30, and we can probably start wrapping up. Let me see if there's anybody who's raised their hand or. Okay, well then, give everybody back their 5 minutes, and thank you for coming. And hopefully this has been helpful. We will certainly please do send your email in the chat. We can let you know when we release the weekly updates. We're targeting Monday, but please don't hold me to that. And we look forward to continuing sharing this information with you and working together to make sure all our communities are counted. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard.
I will, or other will. There's two wills that we're always working with on census.
I know there is no will.
Yeah.
That's good. This is very informative. Very good. Thanks for putting it together with you and Ahmed.
Right. Thanks, Will.
Okay.
Housekeeping for Ahmed or Miriam. We have to save the chat file, right? We'll wait
Yep,
for everybody to.
I saved the chat file.
Okay.
Howard, may I ask the software you use is from what kind of the software you use to gather the data?
Hi. So we download the self-response rate data from the Census Bureau. They have files there. We import it into Excel to organize it, and we use QGIS to graph it to plot it onto a map.
Oh, I see. Good job.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye bye now.
Okay, no problem. Okay. All right, I think everybody's had a chance to type in their email. Probably, and probably end the call now, team.